Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here giving the first Linda Brodsky Memorial Lecture. Linda was not only a great physician, but was a wonderful person and a friend. And as many of you may know, Linda had some issues and experiences herself with gender discrimination. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experiences with gender discrimination. Now, many of you may know of me as the woman doctor at Harvard who got $7 million in a gender bias suit. And I'll tell you, though, why I really am a very unlikely heroine of that story. I grew up in a suburb of Boston, a working-class suburb of Boston. My father and grandfather were Sicilian barbers. And we lived in a two-family house with 4 families. It was across the street from the factory where my mother worked. And I found out later that actually our neighborhood was in the shadow of Harvard, and I found out later that my Italian grandfather actually used to sell his homemade Italian wine to the Harvard students during Prohibition. So that was interesting. They didn't tell me about that at the time. Now, what I thought was really interesting, I was delighted to hear from Dr. Asif that she was given 3 choices about what she could become when she was a young woman. And tell me if I'm not correct here, but I think it was a doctor, an engineer, or a failure. Well, I was also given 3 choices. I went to Catholic school for 12 years, and the nuns told me when I was a junior in high school that I had 3 choices, but they weren't those 3. I could be a nun, a nurse, or a teacher. That was it. Those were the 3 choices. So I went off to college, and of course I lived at home because my Sicilian parents told me that I would be a puttana if I lived at school. So I lived at home and went off to college and majored in math to be a math teacher. My 2 older sisters had gone in to be teachers. And when I got there, I found out that there were other options. There were other things I could do. So I decided to major in mechanical engineering, even though there hadn't been a woman in the engineering school for 6 years before me, and I was the only one in my class. And I must admit, at that time, there were a lot of jokes about me, and people used to razz me because I was a woman. In those days, you really didn't do much about it. And I remember taking it in stride when I was not allowed to go on a class field trip to the Tennessee Valley Authority because women are bad luck in tunnels. And also, I remember one day they're making me stand outside in the freezing cold when my class visited a foundry because the men in the foundry were not comfortable having a woman come inside because they had a lot of pornographic calendars and posters and such out. And I didn't really say much about it. And even when I was an engineering student and I was told I could not take a particular course in biomedical engineering because I was a woman, I didn't do much. Now that's a very interesting story that's worth mentioning. The fellow who was giving this course was a guy named Dr. Stanley Charm. And here I was about 19 years old. I went to his office because I was an undergraduate and I wanted to take this graduate course in biomedical engineering. And I had to get his permission. And he sat me down and told me that I should be ashamed of myself, being a woman, taking a job from a man who's going to have to support a family, that I would never succeed, I would never graduate, and no woman will ever take his class. And I left his office crying. You know, and in 1972, you didn't do much about it. But what's great about this story is that 20 years later, when I was director of the Pain Management Center at Harvard, he was referred to me for an epidural steroid injection in his spine. Hey, what goes around comes around, right? Right? Anyways, the reason I'm telling you all this is because I never thought of myself as a feminist. I really thought of myself as a very unlikely person to be an activist. When I went to medical school in 1973, there were very few women in my class, and I remember a few of them really wanted to start a protest because all of the textbooks referred to the average 70-kilogram man instead of the 68-kilogram person. And I remember thinking that this was a non-issue. And besides, I was too busy working 4 jobs trying to put myself through medical school to really get involved in any of this. So I really didn't. I graduated from medical school. I did an internship in medicine and surgery. This is me in 1976 during my internship. And subsequently, I did a residency at Massachusetts General Hospital and Beth Israel Hospital in Boston at Harvard in anesthesiology. And I married one of our fellow residents, Rick Warfield, in 1976. And actually my son, my oldest, was born while I was a fellow. And we subsequently had 2 other children, so I had 3 children altogether. And Rick, unfortunately, tragically died when my youngest was 5 months old in 1988. And I was left as the sole support of my family, my 3 children. And what's interesting about that is when you look at the statistics, I remember being told these statistics when I was a resident at Mass General. In 1972, there were 752 full professors at Harvard. 14 of them were women. Many were the daughters or wives of other professors, and I certainly wasn't that. And what was most fascinating was that they had a total of 1 child among the 14. In those days, you just didn't have children and be a professor and have that sort of career. So that's another reason why I was an unlikely candidate to end up as a professor at Harvard. Well, between 1980 and 2000, I climbed the academic rank at Harvard Medical School. I became as I mentioned, I was director of the Pain Management Center. I started that in 1980. I became the vice chairman for academic affairs in our department, and as I said, rose through the ranks. And in 1996, our hospital went through a bloody merger. And at that time, I was the highest ranking academic person in our department. And I was asked to step up to the plate to become the chairman of the Department of Anesthesia, Critical Care, and Pain Medicine. I really wasn't interested in doing it at that time. It was a difficult time for my family. One of my children is disabled. It really wasn't something that I wanted to do, but I knew they needed me, and I did it. I became chairman in 2000. And shortly thereafter, I became the first woman at Harvard and Beth Israel Deaconess to have an endowed professor. This is my mentor, Dr. Heather White, in 2000. So along I went as department chairman. I took a department that was essentially moribund because of this merger. We had lost half of the anesthesia department. We'd lost a lot of the surgeons. We'd lost the chief of anesthesia, the chief of surgery, and I turned that moribund department into a working department to rave reviews across departmental lines and from the administration. Unfortunately, very shortly thereafter, things changed for me. A new chief of surgery came on board, a guy named Dr. Joseph Fisher. Dr. Fisher had had problems with women at his former institution, but they hired him anyway because the hospital was kind of in a difficult position because of the merger. They were losing a lot of money. They hired this fellow anyway, and things changed for me. Some of the things he did were little things, and some of the things he did were not so little. He verbally abused and physically intimidated women doctors in the operating room. He called me Miss Warfield. He slammed doors in my face. He spoke to my male subordinates rather than me when we were at meetings. He refused to meet with me one-on-one, which is really tough when you have an anesthesia chief and a surgical chief. He then started a campaign to have me removed as chief and made false clinical accusations against me. I demanded to the hospital that these accusations be investigated, and the hospital just did nothing. Now, interestingly, around the same time, one of the nurses sent me this email. Dr. Fisher had asked for us to have an in-service with him one afternoon regarding dressing changes. The in-service turned into a badgering against his residents. He basically said that he wanted residents from the western part of the state, no international schools, and that his residents should be tall, light-skinned, Western-taught American men. And again, when this was brought to their attention, nothing was done. So very shortly after Dr. Fisher came on board, a new CEO came on board, Mr. Paul Levy. I took my concerns first to Dr. Fisher, and when I did, he threatened me. I then went to Mr. Levy, I should say, and Mr. Levy clearly did not take my concerns seriously. One of the female anesthesiologists who had been verbally abused in the operating room went to the Physicians' Health Committee. And shortly after she did that, our new CEO told the Physicians' Health Committee that their charge had changed and they were no longer to deal with behavioral problems, just substance abuse problems. And I asked several times to meet with Mr. Levy to talk about these issues. And on one occasion, rather than meeting in his office, he suggested that we take a walk around the hospital. And when he put his arm around me behind the hospital, I knew at that point that he wasn't going to take me seriously. And I really knew that I had little recourse. After that, he essentially sent me an email telling me that I was playing victim and that I should, quote, adjust to the personal approach of Dr. Fisher. And that included having him work with my male subordinates if he didn't want to work with me. And I said, no, that's not going to happen. So I refused to adjust to his approach. My job was then threatened. He sent me this email saying, I raise my concerns that you engage in behavior which appears to be, quote, playing the victim. I believe that the potential impact on patient care resulting from the current failure to achieve an acceptable level of collegial relations is extremely important and a material element of your performance under your employment contract. As of this date, the current level of performance in this area does not meet the required level. So I sent him this email, and this is when things really started to get bad. I told him I disagreed with his characterization of my performance and that the difficulties revolved exclusively around Dr. Fisher and his inability to work with women in general and me in particular. And as I said, when I put this in writing, and I encourage you to do this sort of thing, when I put this in writing, this is when things really started to pick up, let's say. Not in a nice way. At that point, I was subject to a tremendous amount of scrutiny. The hospital hired an outside group to do a review of my department. And interestingly, it backfired on them because the review did not show that there were deficiencies in my leadership, but rather that Dr. Fisher had problems with women. Of course, I didn't know about this until my litigation was going on because they gave me a redacted form, review form. So I didn't know about this until much later, which was very interesting. You learn a lot of things during the course of litigation. After that, they accused me of wrongdoing because of a severance plan that one of my predecessors as chief of anesthesia had set up, and I was cleared of that. Then they started telling me I wasn't going to be eligible for bonuses, et cetera, et cetera. So my performance was placed under quite a bit of scrutiny at this time. So in this sort of position, what do? I went to the chief of surgery, I talked to other chiefs, I certainly went to the CEO many times, I went to the chief operating officer, I went to the chairman of the board of the hospital and got my hand slapped for doing that. I went to the vice president for human resources, who did nothing. I went to the head of the committee on women's careers at the hospital. She was a woman surgeon who actually sided with me and subsequently was fired. I went to the head of the physicians group, who did nothing. I went to the head of the Physicians' Health Committee, and again, as I told you, he said that he was told he no longer should deal with any behavioral problems. I went to the chairman of the Harvard Medical School Joint Committee on the Status of Women, but unfortunately, that committee had no power at all. I went to the ombudsperson at Harvard. The ombudsperson told me, you should get a lawyer. And she prefaced that by saying, you have to understand, though, that if you get a lawyer and you take this to litigation, you will never work in your field again. And she was right. But that was her advice at that time. I then went to the dean of faculty at Harvard, who was a woman and said was very sympathetic, but basically said her hands were tied and that the dean would talk to the CEO and to the chief of surgery, but again, there were no changes. I went to the administrative dean at Harvard, and finally I went to the dean of the medical school. And as I said, nothing changed. I really felt at that point that I had hit a brick wall. All through this period, I was trying to deal with things the way I always did. I was trying to deal with being a woman in a man's field with humor, with hard work, and with thick skin. And as I said, at that point, I really felt like I was up against a brick wall. There was an imperial head of the hospital who was supporting a sexist chief of surgery. So I felt I really had no recourse. And 5 years after Dr. Fisher came to our department, I received this email from the CEO. Dr. Warfield, I believe it's time to seek new leadership of the department. Per your provisions of your employment contract, I'm removing you from your position of Chief of Service, effective immediately. Now, in my mind, I won't even talk about the fact that this came in an email, but in my mind, effective immediately was usually reserved for doctors who were on drugs or were some danger to a patient. And of course, rumors started circulating that I must have done something really egregious to deserve this effective immediately firing. And I had done nothing. I did nothing to deserve this. The chief of surgery wasn't punished, and he wasn't fired, nothing happened to him. But I was fired for what I thought was standing up to a biased and retaliatory chief of surgery and a CEO who was supporting him. I then tried to meet with the CEO. I tried to set up meetings to discuss a reasonable compromise. He wouldn't hear of it. I asked him if I could stay at least until they found a new chief of anesthesia. He said no. I asked to stay long enough to tie up loose ends in my office and discuss my departure with my faculty. They wouldn't even let me back in my office. I asked for what I thought was reasonable severance, and they said no. Sometimes you just have to say enough is enough, and that was the point for me. So I hired a lawyer, and hiring a lawyer is interesting. That was an interesting story in itself. I got networked with a lot of people I knew in Boston to ask who the best employment lawyers were. And as I called them one by one, most of them said to me, you've got a great case and we feel it really badly, but we do business with Harvard and with the hospitals and we really can't get involved. And some of them even said, we want to in the future do business with Harvard and the teaching hospitals, so we don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. But I was lucky. I found two lawyers, Laura Student and Ellen Zucker, and I think really without them and their expertise, the outcome would have been very different. So first, my lawyers tried to reason with the hospital. They talked to the hospital lawyers. They tried to come to some sort of compromise, just as I had done. But they were unsuccessful at that. And we finally filed a complaint with the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, and later filed an action in court. Now here's something that I didn't know at the time, which is that if the hospital had settled with me or had come to some agreement with me at that point, for instance, if they were going to pay me a salary or whatever, the money would have come out of their coffers. But once you start litigation, it comes from the insurance company. So the defendants actually have an incentive for you to embark upon litigation and not settle with you or not come to any agreement before you sue them, because they want the money or whatever you get to come from the insurance company and not from the hospital. So we went forward with litigation, and the next thing that happened to me was in some ways more difficult than being fired, and that was retaliation. And you hear about retaliation's against the law, they can't do that. Don't believe it. Of course they do. Very shortly thereafter, I received a letter saying that my benefits were being stopped. Now again, I had been a part of that department. I had run the pain center for 30 years, and I still had my privileges with the hospital. But I was told there was no academic, administrative, or teaching role for me in the hospital. I could come back as a clinician, but what they were going to pay me was less than what a junior physician just out of residency was going to make. And I was told that, and by the way, if you want to come back and work as a clinician, you have to retrain. So I was also told, they also told other folks in our department that I was not to be invited to lecture to the residents. I was removed as founder of the pain clinic from the hospital website. I had no office. I was the only full professor in the hospital who had no office, and when I asked for an office, I was directed to a communal secretarial station. I was told that I couldn't set up a mentoring program for the department when I asked to do that. The Committee on Women's Health, as I mentioned, on women's careers, I should say, was dismantled. And I asked to be on a number of other committees at the medical school and at the hospital, and I was told no. Search committees and such, I was told no. And I was denied other positions. So the ombudsperson's warning rang true. Nobody wants to hire someone who's suing their employer. So I went back to work on a per diem basis with no benefits, seeing patients in the pain clinic. I was the most junior person in the pain clinic seeing patients, went back on a per diem basis, and on my own time, I embarked upon my own academic interests and international health interests and such. And this went on for quite some time. Now, litigation is an interesting process. It's a long and tedious process. And it's interesting because you really find out who your friends are when you embark upon litigation. I would have a lot of people who would stop me in the hallway and say, oh, you know, I hear you're suing the hospital, that's great, here's what happened to me. And they would tell me their stories about Dr. Fisher and Mr. Levy. And when I would say, oh, that's great, you know, would you be willing to testify? They would say, oh, you know, I've got kids in college. I couldn't possibly do that. I can't afford to lose my job, but we're, you know, you go, girl. We're there for you. But, you know, there were some longtime friends and colleagues who really I was humbled by their actions. They really stood firm by me. And there were a number of women surgeons who really did stand up and tell their stories. These were women in the Department of Surgery under Dr. Fisher, many of whom were forced to leave the department during his tenure and couldn't tell their stories for fear of retaliation. There had been a number of women surgeons who had complained about gender discrimination prior to this, and many of them were blackballed by their chiefs of surgery, who often held positions very high positions in national surgical organizations. And in fact, one woman at another hospital told me that when she complained as a senior resident, all of the offers that she had been given for jobs were withdrawn, and she had to actually go out of the country to get a job. So retaliation is alive and well. But these women surgeons, when deposed, gave often tearful accounts of what had happened to them. And it really brought me to tears when they called me their hero. And there were others who stood up for me. The chief of anesthesia at the Children's Hospital in Boston stood up and told what Dr. Fisher had been saying about me outside of the hospital. There were, however, many people who I thought were my supporters who turned out to be allies for the hospital. And I think sometimes people do this because they're worried about their own pocketbooks, or some people do it because they think that aligning themselves with a hospital will forward their own careers, or maybe they're just ignorant about hospital politics. I don't really blame them, but this is what happens. The women surgeons, though, had, as I said, really tearful stories to tell, which were quite heartwarming. I'm not going to go into the details, but during the deposition process, during the discovery process of a lawsuit, you learn all kinds of interesting things. I mentioned that I heard about my review during that process. But I also learned that they had long-standing plans to fire me, that I was too aggressive yet too meek, I was too obstreperous, I was too quiet. There were other discriminatory practices that had been tolerated. I found out about these. I found I'd been excluded from a number of meetings and activities, and actually my Sicilian heritage was at issue. Fascinating. One other question that often comes up about this is about the money. Early on, when I first embarked on litigation, I decided to do this to basically not use a contingency, but basically pay for my legal fees, because I thought, oh, what's it going to be? A couple phone calls, they're going to talk to the lawyers at the hospital, and we're going to resolve this whole issue. No, it didn't happen. In 2012, before I went to trial, I had spent about $1.2 million on legal fees. And the costs of litigation aren't just in money. There are costs in emotional and physical ways also. And by the end of this, I was taking antidepressants, and I was on proton pump inhibitors, because, you know, the corrosive nature of discrimination makes you start to doubt yourself. Here I was an endowed professor at Harvard, I wrote all these textbooks, and yet I was still doubting myself. I didn't want to get up in the morning and go to work. So there is a big toll. 6 years of litigation went on. The defendants dug their heels in. Some of the motions actually went to the Supreme Court of Massachusetts. Dr. Fisher's privileges were eventually revoked, and he was removed as chief. The CEO eventually resigned because of an, quote, improper relationship with a paramour. He eventually left. And I agreed to settle on the following grounds. First and foremost, that a public statement be made about the suit and its outcome. That policies and systems at Beth Israel Deaconess for reporting and dealing with concerns of discrimination be put in place. They named the pain clinic in my honor. My professorship at Harvard continued. There was training for chiefs of service on discrimination. There was a lecture series for women in surgery, and $7 million. And our beloved Linda Brodsky published this article shortly after my settlement, which she called the 5 miracles of Carol Warfield's settlement. She said the first one was the settlement wasn't a secret, because most of the time when people settle with these cases, you never hear about it. They have a gag order or something, you can't talk about it. Secondly, I didn't have to leave the hospital. Thirdly, I received due recognition. The pain clinic was named after me. There will be institutional action to improve the environment. And this fifth one, no fault, no admission of guilt, was softened by words of conciliation. And here's what she was referring to. The legal counsel for the defense actually said, this case serves as a reminder that with time and consideration, people of goodwill can learn from one another. As we look back on this case, there are lessons for the institution. And I have, lastly, a few words of advice for any of you who think about embarking on litigation. Find an attorney who you trust early on. You can confidentially get advice from the attorney about how to frame and resolve issues way before you even talk about litigation. Litigation really should be your last resort. Keep an accurate chronology and good documentation, but don't do that on the hospital computer. Remember, the hospital has access to all the records. They had access to all the records in my office that they essentially locked me out of. They have access to every email you ever wrote to anyone, and they used these. And they certainly have more resources than you, not just money, but they have access to all the witnesses. All the people who worked with me were still employees of the hospital. So they could go and talk to these people and do whatever, whereas I could not. And I think as a woman, we really need to support each other and leave the door open to those who follow. Call out discriminatory conduct when it happens. Women are often still treated as visitors rather than participants, so there's still much work to be done. Now, Dr. S7 had mentioned that, as I said, that she had 3 choices given to her. I believe it was a doctor, an engineer, and a failure, and I guess I was all 3. but I really feel that I'm better off for it all. Thank you very much.